Massa crossed the line. He's done everything he needed to do. And now we have to wait to see what Hamilton does. And then Martin goes, wait, is that Glock? And I'm like, yes, it's Glock, it's Glock. Oh no, 100,000 Brazilian hearts sink in the grandstands, you know. And Hamilton wins the world championship. But you had to measure it all the way across the line.
Hi, I'm Mark Priestley. I spent almost a decade at the McLaren Formula One team alongside inspirational people such as Kimi Räikkönen, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, but also people like Adrian Newey and Ron Dennis. I created the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast to share many of those things that I've learnt with you to help you to think about the challenges in your life a little bit more like a Formula One team might think about them. Enjoy. Today's guest is James Allen. A certain generation of Formula One fans will know James as the voice of some of the sport's most iconic moments in history. Today he works with large media organisations, he works in the business side of this sport, and he's also working with Liberty Media to help shape the future of Formula One. We had a great conversation about some of the amazing things he's learned from working closely with drivers like Michael Schumacher, Nigel Mansell, even Ayrton Senna, and comparing those to the modern day superstars of our sport. But also what he's learned about working in the higher echelons of business surrounding Formula One. There are lots of lessons you will benefit from, and stay listening right to the very, very end for some great little nuggets on how to live a more high performance life. Welcome to Pitlane Life Lessons. James, thanks so much for joining us. I want to go straight in here at a moment that we both experienced from slightly different perspectives. I'm sure you've been asked about it a lot, but 2008 in Brazil, you kind of told this now immortal story of Lewis Hamilton crossing the line to win his first world championship. I was experiencing it from in the garage. But I listened to it back yesterday. It genuinely gave me goosebumps. And obviously part of that is the moment itself. But a big part of it is the way you and your co-commentator Martin Brundle told that story. How do you remember the emotion from that day?
Well, Mark, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be on the podcast with you. I've known you obviously for donkey's years, and you're doing a fantastic job. So it's really a privilege to be here. So as a kid, you know, growing up, I really remember in the early 70s watching like big sports events like Muhammad Ali fights. I remember getting my gran, who was babysitting me once, to wake me up in the early hours of the morning. I was about 6 or 7 or something, to watch Ali fight, and she did. It was fantastic. But I was watching it because he was such a charismatic figure. And for me, it was always the person that was describing what was going on, putting the soundtrack, the words onto it, was always fascinating to me. And as I got older, I kind of just really decided that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put the soundtrack on Formula One races, particularly because Formula One was the best of the best. And I will talk about it a bit later on, but I grew up in a racing family. So, you know, I love football. I'm a big Liverpool fan and have been all my life, season ticket holder, and I love Formula One. But Formula One is where I wanted to work because I grew up in a racing family. And so it was that was the goal, that was the ambition. I was very clear about why I wanted to do this. And I made my way up. I'm sure we'll talk about that too. So that moment, in a way, was perfect because, you know, it's like the Kenneth Wolstenholme moment, you know, with the 1966 Football World Cup final. You know, they think it's all over, and her scores, it is now. And it's like, you know, very few commentators get to have a moment like that where you can sort of really crystallize a moment in history and sporting history. And it's a great privilege when you get that opportunity, but it's also important to meet the moment.
Well,
you know, it's not, you can't. Some commentators turn up with like reams of notes, and if this happens, I'll say this, or if this happens, I'll say that, or whatever. And I never really wanted to do that because it takes the spontaneity away. That doesn't mean you don't prepare. You do prepare. Yeah. I listened to your Harry Benjamin podcast, and he was talking about how he feels he has to over-prepare because he feels kind of like he's got a lot to prove and all that sort of thing. And I can understand that. I always approached it more like revising for an exam, you know. You need to think on your feet in an exam at school or whatever. And if you're prepared, you give yourself a chance. Yeah. And Murray Walker was kind of a big mentor to me, obviously. And he had a meticulous note, but then, as we all know, he then just completely went for it. But he did it on the basis that he knew what was going to come around. So that day, amazing day, you remember it well. Really hard race for teams to judge, drivers to judge. It was raining, then it wasn't raining, then it was raining again. You had cars that were out on, we had groove tires in those days. There were slicks were, you know, and some people were out on intermediates or wets, whatever it may be. And of course the Toyotas were the sort of were mixed in there, and Hamilton had to get past them. And it was important to stay calm, first of all. I remember Martin and I, we worked together a lot. I think we did about 160 Grand Prix together or something in the commentary box. And so we were, we obviously were pretty in tune with each other, and we knew each other's roles. And I kept looking out. I remember opening the back of the commentary box door to see how hard it was raining, and as an experienced guy, the visuals are important. You can really see. And you could see that, the rain was intensifying and all the rest of it. And it gave Hamilton a chance because the Toyotas would be struggling. And so we measured our way to the outcome. But then you need to be ready to meet the moment and have the words and the soundtrack. And, it's like, when Massa crossed the line, Massa crosses the line, he's done everything he needed to do. And now we have to wait to see what Hamilton does. And then Martin goes, wait, is that Glock? And I'm like, yes, it's Glock, it's Glock. Oh no, 100,000 Brazilian hearts sink in the grandstands, and Hamilton wins the world championship. But you had to measure it all the way across the line. And it was a very fit an apt way to end the ITV experience, because it was that moment. And there were one or two others as well before that, but that was the moment to find the right words, and Martin and I found the right words.
Well, you absolutely did, and I want to explore that a little bit, because it was such a big moment, obviously for you, it was for me in our own ways, but for millions of fans. That season was a huge story in itself, particularly in the UK where you were broadcasting for ITV. It was a massive set of
story. They were taking it around the world as well, and Canada and all the English-speaking world was taking it.
It was a huge moment, I think, in sport generally, let alone Formula One. And so the fact that you did get it right, I wondered what it was that led to that. And partly, I as you know, my wife Claire worked with you as part of the ITV team that year.
Yes, what a character.
And she is. I was chatting to her yesterday about it because you won a BAFTA for that coverage. And part of the judge's decision, when I was looking it up yesterday, they specifically noted that the closing lap's worth of commentary was a real deciding factor. First of all, that's got to make you hugely proud. But also, you just touched on some of the characteristics required to make sure you were ready for that moment. I asked Claire, I said, what do you remember about James? I said, what sort of character do you remember him being? She rattled off these words. Calm was one of the first things. You just said you had to be calm. She said, calm, passionate, kind, diligent, reflective, and really hardworking with lots of preparation. How does it make you feel hearing someone else say those words about you? And can you resonate with that? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I don't want to talk myself up too much. This is also quite a long time ago now. It's 2025, and this is going back to 2008. But the fact that race and other races are still shown so often by Sky, Formula One stick them on their YouTube a lot. There's an awful lot of these moments and these things. And 2008 was obviously a very, very special Brazil, a very special race. First of all, we mustn't lose sight of the fact you had a groundbreaking world champion, Lewis Hamilton. I first became aware of him when he was 12, 13 years old. I first met him when he was about that age at the Autosport Awards, and we had quite a long chat. And I used to chat with him and his dad, Anthony, every year at the awards because they were always there. And so I saw him coming, and I commentated on his GP2 championship because ITV did GP2 as well, and I volunteered to do that because I was really interested, and it was an amazing season. So, all of that feeds into that preparation. I was part of that journey. I was talked a lot with him and his dad throughout that year. The pressure that they were under, the pressure, to be fair, that Anthony put Lewis under as well was pretty intense. I think that there was a time when they had to rebalance that because it got a bit much. And it's great to see that they're really united again now. But it was something else. So, just that fact that you had your first black, driver, not only winning races, but winning a world championship at such a young age. Of course, he could have done it the year before. I was not very happy with your team, as you probably remember from the Chinese Grand Prix when you didn't bring him in, when he was clearly going to be struggling on those tyres in the conditions, and a win got thrown away. And it's interesting because McLaren, I think, tied themselves really in knots that season and gave the championship to Ferrari in 07. It was such a mess. They got inside their own heads. And I love Ron Dennis. I know it's an unusual thing to say. I think he's an amazing guy. And I always used to say that he's the best and the worst thing about McLaren. Yeah. His meticulousness, his preparation, all those details, amazing. But equally, there was something about him that could also make the team kind of go on a giant wobble. And 07 was the perfect example. So
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, well, you lived it.
I also think that actually, just to digress slightly, but I also think that we won the championship largely in response to losing it in the way we did in 07.
I always thought that.
Without those horrendous failures, perhaps we wouldn't have been as good in 08. But anyway, what you've done there is nicely swerved this question about how good you are. And
I'm just not. It's funny because I talk. I did 25 years as a broadcaster, which I'm very proud of that chapter of my career, and I always wanted to challenge myself and all the rest of it. But it was a chapter, and I don't broadcast anymore. I do a podcast, as you know, but I don't do live commentary anymore, and I don't particularly want to return to it. I've had opportunities. I've been asked to go back. I didn't put myself forward for the Sky job. I didn't want to do it, and I did all the things I wanted to do. I wanted to challenge myself by doing radio, because I got the opportunity in 2012 to do BBC Radio 5 Live, which you've got a lot of experience of yourself. You're doing it at the moment.
Well, my first foray into commentary was alongside you. I was Pitlane reporting alongside Jenny Gow that day, but it was with you in the commentary box.
Exactly. I wanted to do that because the radio was being reinvented by the internet. And I just thought, this is really interesting. I love radio, and I thought there's some interesting possibilities. And also as a discipline, I'd done 20-something years of TV commentary and presentation, but I'd never done any radio, and I just wanted to tick that box. And actually, it was much harder than I thought it was going to be. A lot of people go from radio to TV.
Yeah.
And then they have to learn to say less, because you have to talk all the time in radio.
Yeah.
Whereas with telly, you let the pictures talk as well, and you need to find the right soundtrack for it. But again, it was a challenge I really enjoyed. And so, as I say, I'm not really used to talking about myself. I'm used to talking about the racing. But I've always had the principle that it's an amazing world. I love the people in racing. I grew up with them. I understand the racing mentality. My father was a professional racing driver. Yeah. He won kind of the equivalent of GT Pro at Le Mans 24 hours in 1961. He was a serious racing driver, and then when he retired from professional racing, he organised the first historic racing championships sponsored by JCB in the early 1970s. And so, I kind of grew up with that. I saw my dad racing kind of D-type Jaguars he didn't own them, obviously. They were owned by other people, but he was organising the championships, and he was in the thick of it all. And quite often they would be the support act on a Grand Prix weekend at Silverstone or Brands Hatch. So as a little kid, like 5, 6, 7 years old, I was going to motor races and seeing my dad in that context, but meeting lots of these people and just looking in their eyes and seeing racers and what drives a racer, that passion, that rage to compete that they have. You know what I'm talking about. It's when you get a driver come into your team, you could see whether they got the stuff or not just by looking them in the eyes, can't you?
Yeah. And I guess that's I was going to get there is that your racing background is in your family racing background, and this immersion in the racing world from quite a young age. What do you think you learned? Some of those characteristics that I just read out there, that the sort of competitive nature, the idea of preparing, but even perhaps the calmness. Did any of that, do you think, come from that world?
All of it did, Mark. All of it did. It's all rubbed off on me. It's no question about it. And then as I worked my way up and I got better and better access, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it later on, but I had amazing opportunities as well as doing the broadcasting. I was always keen on writing as well. And Nigel Mansell asked me to go over to America in 1994. I kind of had to juggle. I was working with ESPN then in Formula One. So I did the whole 93 season in Formula One for ESPN. 94, I was in America with Mansell, behind the scenes with him on his IndyCar campaign. And then I was also doing some Grand Prix for ESPN. So that was a bit of a juggle. But I got asked to present this show, Nigel Mansell's IndyCar 94, with him on ITV, and then at the same time write his autobiography with him, which was a fascinating exercise. I read Magic Johnson's autobiography and all these other people, and I just ghostwriting a mega sports star's autobiography is such an interesting thing because you get inside their head. And of course, I was living the experience behind the scenes with him as he was traveling around America, and got into the mindset of a world champion at the top of his game. Did it then again in 98 when I got the opportunity to write a book about Michael Schumacher after he crashed into Villeneuve. And I sold the idea to him and his then assistant, Heine Buchinger. I said, look, I'm going to write a book about how Michael wins back not only tries to win a world championship, but tries to win back his image after what he did. Yeah. And they said, yeah, all right, yeah, we'll do it with you.
Amazing.
And I got, and Michael just sort of sorted it out with Ferrari and Jean Todt and Ross Brawn. I was in Maranello, I was in Fiorano. You saw that picture of Lewis the other day when he was a Ferrari driver with his tie and everything. The building he's standing in front of was Enzo Ferrari's office. Yeah. Schumacher used to sleep in that office. I used to go in there and talk to him and when I was writing this book. So you get that close to these people, And all of it rubs off on you, because how they achieve high performance, how they achieve excellence, the relentlessness with which they have to go about things.
Thanks so much for getting this far through today's episode. I would love it if you could interact somehow with the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast by dropping us a like or a comment, a rating, wherever it is you're listening or watching. It really makes a massive difference. Back to the episode. Let's explore that. I was going to get there, so let's do it now. I mean, what do you think were the big things that you learned? I mean, the Schumacher, I think let's come on to Schumacher in a minute. Let's start with Mansell. What do you think you learned? Are there any big takeaways that you learned? Because that, I guess, was your first experience of being really up close and personal for an extended period of time with a world champion. Was there anything that you noticed getting that close that you hadn't seen perhaps from afar when you were just covering the sport from a slight distance?
Well, many things, obviously, in that experience, because Mansell is a very particular character. Yeah. And it's really important also to say that the person he is today is quite different from the person he was back then. He was 40 years old. He was a Formula One world champion, and he was an IndyCar champion. So he had proved to everybody what he had known all along, but the rest of the world seemed to doubt. And so a huge part of what he was about was proving everybody wrong, that he was a terrific racing driver. And to be honest with you, one world championship doesn't really do justice to his passion and his talent, really. He was a much better racing driver than people give him credit for. He was also a much better engineering brain than people give him credit for. And I had an amazing conversation with Patrick Head once where he basically said Mansell's way better in the car than Prost. Everyone goes, oh, Prost, the professor. Yeah. He's like, no. He said Nigel was, he would remember his settings on when they had the active car and all the different, complicated settings they had for the active suspension. And Nigel would remember half laps and the different settings and what the car behavior was. And he'd literally come back in after a sort of 5-lap or a 10-lap run and do a full technical debrief. He said there's nobody else that drove that car could do that.
It's really interesting, isn't it? That detail.
The detail. It's not what you think when you think of Mansell, No. But what made Mansell, without a doubt, was his commitment. I mean, the thing that him and Senna had that stood out was commitment. Senna was all in. He was always going to either make him the greatest ever or kill himself. Yeah. And obviously, sadly, it ended up both, really, in some ways. But and Nigel was absolutely on it, and he was all in. And there was a certain power that he had, which I've not really encountered anywhere else either, which Gerhard Berger commented on when I wrote the book. He said, it's like Nigel's got a switch in his head. He said, when you talk to him in the paddock and stuff, he's all like coasting mode, it's all very laid back. And he said, but when you're racing against him in a car, you can feel the power, you can feel the energy coming off the car. It's like a force field. He said there's a sort of switch that goes in his head, and he said he becomes a completely different person. And you could absolutely see that. So I think that was just so interesting to see that champion and then see the family man. He was a very, very committed family man. His wife, Roseanne, and their 3 kids were growing up in Florida. I spent lots of time in his house. Just seeing this guy who's like a world-famous sports star, kind of eating shepherd's pie and peas, having had a game of tennis on his court in the background, where he went into every bloody ball with the same amount of commitment as he went into a fight with Senna or Berger on the track. I mean, I said, Nigel, calm down. It's like, this was 4 days before the Indy 500, and he ended up with a massive ice pack on his elbow because he'd gone for this ball he was never going to get, and he'd smashed into the lighting pylon with his elbow 4 days before the Indy 500.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that trait, the competitive animal in lots of Formula One drivers, where they tend to be very good at everything they do, whether it's mountain biking or motocrossing or whatever, because they go all in. What I guess jumps out at me from that and is less familiar to me is this idea of being able to switch between the different modes of your character so succinctly. A lot of drivers can't do that. I think you're one character all the way through. You see them in the paddock, they're the same character you might find out on the racetrack, and that's quite interesting as a trait. And I wonder how much that enabled him to build relationships, because he wasn't this aggressive, competitive animal. When you had a chat with him, he was a very nice, affable guy. And perhaps being able to switch between those really enabled him to build relationships, and perhaps in the longer longevity of his career, that's helped him. Relationships matter, don't they?
There's an awful lot to unpack in what you've just said. I mean, we could probably make the rest of the podcast on this. But so Patrick Head said to me for that project, he said, well, two things are really interesting. He said there are very few people who know what it takes to win in Formula One, and Nigel definitely was one of them. And he said the other thing Patrick said, which is really important, was he said very few drivers, are able to flatten out the difference between on days and off days. Nigel's not a driver who had on days and off days. He was always on.
Yeah.
And so I think what he had, and Senna had, and one or two others, was the ability not to let themselves go down. All of us in our lives, you go through, every given week, you'll have moments where you feel really good about yourself. Something's happened, or you feel really good about, you feel really positive. And then you'll have other moments where you feel kind of pulled down by things, whether it's something that happened at home, or something's happening at work, or just some setbacks, whatever. And it's really hard, especially I think today, to not get pulled down by it, and what I saw with them in their professional lives was they were always able to maintain like a level and never let themselves, especially in the car, get pulled down.
Well, interestingly, with Lewis, just in recent times, we've seen the opposite of that, haven't we? We've seen him really get pulled down, and potentially that affecting his results.
And Lewis is another guy with a very strong mentality, obviously, and he's got nothing to prove to anybody as a racing driver. I couldn't believe some of the things he said in the second half of last season, because it's like he'd got on a real downer inside his head about it. And that's one thing, but then to actually let it be seen that he'd gone, it was another thing. I think he somehow felt that sharing that vulnerability was a very modern and positive thing to do. But for me, in a racing context, it was really surprising because maintaining that sort of that level is the way that champions have always done things. And Schumacher was the great example of that. He radiated confidence. His skin was taut on his face. He walked into the paddock. He already looked like he'd won the World Championship before anyone had got in the cars, because he just looked so confident. Yeah. Inside, actually, Schumacher was quite a vulnerable person. Yeah. And there's a whole backstory as to why that is, because basically he was forced to kind of build a very strong protective shell around himself as a kid, because he was going around kart racing around Germany and then Europe as he became more successful. His dad had no money and he couldn't afford to go with him because he had to work. So other people's dads and other people were paying for Schumacher to race karts. So he was going around Europe with these, you can imagine, like tough German beer drinking, tough guys. And he's a kid and he had to create this protection around himself. And that was the veneer that the world saw of Michael Schumacher. But inside Schumacher was actually quite a sensitive person, quite a generous person to the people he cares about.
Oh, hugely generous, yeah. I've heard
Unbelievable.
all sorts of stories.
Yeah, I mean, the presents he used to give to the mechanics. Yeah. If you'd been one of Schumacher's mechanics, you'd probably have several nice Rolexes. Yeah. You'd probably have an amazing Colnago racing bike in your garage, and that's just the beginning of it.
Well, Senna actually did similar things with... I'm still friends with some of the guys at McLaren who worked with Senna when he was at McLaren, and similarly, he was very generous with a lot of the people he worked with, and of course the reason behind that is this idea that you're trying to get your team on side.
Absolutely.
You want them to feel appreciated, and you want them to know that you appreciate it. It's very easy in that, particularly today, the size of Formula One teams, to feel completely disconnected. If you're a guy who works in the sort of carbon fibre shop in a factory somewhere, you can feel a million miles away from the actual driver who you never get to see, you never go to a racetrack. So the driver taking the time out to make that connection and make that guy feel appreciated has an impact. And I've felt that from the likes of Lewis and Mika Häkkinen before that, David Coulthard, very good at that. So it does make a difference. So having the understanding like Schumacher had there was really a part of that competitive spirit, right? Because you know that if you build that connection, if you make that guy feel appreciated, you're going to get a little bit more, an extra 1%, and all of that is going to contribute to your opportunities.
We're all human beings at the end of the day, aren't we? And you've been in a team, that discipline that has to exist at the heart of a Formula One team. But we're all human beings, and you're going to perform better in your role as a mechanic or as an engineer or whatever it may be if there's empathy from the person you're there to serve, which is the driver. Yeah. Your job is to make him or her, hopefully soon, the best version of themselves that they can be on every single time that they go out in that car. Yeah. And that's your job, and that's your key KPI. And if that person's got empathy, and it's not an easy balance.
No.
And that's what I think a lot of racing drivers, generally speaking, good racing drivers tend to be selfish because they have to be.
Yeah.
But balancing selfishness with empathy is not an easy thing to do. And Schumacher was very good at that. You know, he was not at all empathetic to the people on the opposite side of the competition, but to the people around him and inside the team and people who he trusted, very empathetic. I mean, I'll give you an example. After you talked about Brazil 08, so the next Grand Prix after that was Australia 09, right?
Yeah.
And of course, ITV had finished, it had gone to BBC, and I'd started my own platform and was doing a new thing, taking on a new challenge. And I was on the grid in Melbourne before the Grand Prix, bumped into Michael, and he's like, "Hey, how are you?" And I said, "I'm good." He said, "How's your new challenge? How's it going?" And he's like, he remembered that I was doing something, you know, and all the rest of it. And I just thought, yeah, that's right. It's to find any racing drivers that you talk to will tell you that it's getting that balance right, which is critical to team building.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, this idea of balance, because when you're looking at high performance, probably in any sector, whether it's business, sport, Formula One, or any aspect of life, high performance tends to come with a need to have this competitive spirit. And some of that has to have that selfishness that you're talking about. If you're in a competitive world and you're against some sort of rival, there's got to be an element where you just focus on yourself to try and excel. But the balance side of that is this idea of empathy, of understanding, of being a nice guy. Who do you think, you know, we know how Schumacher's career played out. You've seen it really up close and personal. He had those bad guy moments, but all the things you just referenced seem like the nicest, most genuine guy in the world. Who do you think got that balance sort of right? Has anyone got it perfectly right and hit that sweet spot? Or have they all been at one end or the other, or just the wrong side of centre? And perhaps, no matter where you were on that scale, it's led towards their eventual success. But is there a sweet spot that you've seen in any particular driver? Or are the nice guys never the really successful ones?
Oh, what a great question. Nice guys often are not successful in Formula One, and that's not just behind the wheel. That's in any role. Although you can learn to box clever, and you can learn to pick your way through the Piranha Club, as it's often been referred to. I mean, I think probably most relevant to the listeners would be to try and keep it sort of to the here and now, and so I would say I would look at someone like Lando Norris, for example, and if I look at Lando's 2024 season, what surprised me was he was able to be more on top of Piastri in Piastri's second season than I thought he would.
Yeah,
I shall be very interested to see if Piastri's performance comes up in 25 to the point where he's matching Lando and beating him more often. He should be. Yeah. He should be. But I think it said a lot about Lando and the level he's at and how high his ceiling is that he was able to pull out so many exceptional performances. However, I do think there was a bit of a culture there, and I don't know if it came from him or he was affected by it, but there was a lack of ruthlessness at the heart of McLaren's 2024 project. They would look at it and say, well, listen, we're happy because we won the Constructors' World Championship, and we haven't done that for a very long time, and a really long time, and we did it and maintained team harmony between Oscar and Lando. But I would say, yes, fair enough, you did. That's true. But I do think the drivers was winnable for them.
Yeah.
And I think if they'd been more ruthless and Lando had been more ruthless at several key moments in the season, I think they could have won the Drivers' World Championship. And in time, I think we'll look back on it that they probably should have. Now, Lando definitely will look back on it in those terms if he doesn't win a championship.
Yeah.
If he does win this year, 2025, then it's water under the bridge. But for me, in absolute terms, you know, with my experience of Formula One and experiencing the way I have through the eyes of Senna, first of all, Mansell, Schumacher, you know, that was a winnable championship for McLaren with more ruthlessness, which all three of those guys would have demonstrated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder if that's a trait that he will now feel he needs to develop. I mean,
he has to.
In a similar way that I just said, we perhaps at McLaren wouldn't have won in 2008 without the failures in inverted commas of 2007. I wonder if that's the same thing. You know, this 24 season for McLaren, they learnt a huge amount through some pretty epic failures at times where they got things wrong. They came out of it with a championship, so it's not a complete disaster by any stretch. But I think the learnings will be exactly that. I think from a driver and team perspective, they will learn, they'll build confidence, first of all, but secondly, they will have to be more ruthless. And at some point in a championship, whenever you get a situation when your two drivers in one single team have a chance of winning the title, it's very, very difficult to keep the harmony that they managed to keep, this in 2024. Perhaps that harmony came because they didn't, push on and win the championship. I've never seen, I don't think I can, maybe you can tell me if you have, but I've never seen a situation in Formula One history where one team has had two drivers going for the championship and the title's going to go to one of or the other of them, and they've remained friends. I can't think of an occasion when that's happened.
Whoa, no, I can't. I mean, I don't know what the relationship today is like between Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello, but I mean, Rubens being the kind of personality that he is, the 2009 championship, Jenson had a formidable start in that Brawn car. He got off to a great start. And then Rubens was Jenson had a bit of a wobble in the second half, and he was clinging on and just trying to keep the scoreboard ticking over, even though obviously the car was competitive. Vettel and Red Bull came back at them, but also Barrichello was winning races, and he won Monza famously and all the rest of it. And there were, at the end of the day, Jenson got across the line, but I don't know what the relationship's like between them. But you're right. I mean, it's inevitable, because the thing is, it's such a hard thing to do, to win a Formula One Drivers' World Championship, because you don't just have to have the right car. You then have to have the team around you executing flawlessly 24 times a year, or however many Grand Prix there are in a season. You have to be flawless and make as few mistakes as possible. But then on top of that, you've got to make sure, if the fella in the same car on the other side of the garage is matching you or beating you, that's a huge problem. So you've got all of these things to contend with, and that's before you even think about the competition.
That's right. Yeah.
Because they're going to come up and down, especially at the moment with the rules as they are. Small updates can make a big difference in the pecking order. So again, back to Lando. There's a brilliant line in the Senna documentary Asif Kapadia and Manish Pandey made, which was a groundbreaking piece of work, I think, where Senna says, it had to be my way. Today, it had to be my way. And if you watch that documentary back, he's talking about, he uses it a couple of times, but particularly when he drove Prost off the road in 1990 in Suzuka, it has to be my way. Yeah. No more of this nonsense. And I think Lando would never drive somebody off the road like Senna did with Prost like that at Suzuka. But well, I hope he wouldn't anyway. But he needs to dial up that it has to be my way a lot more, because in the other car is a guy who I'll be disappointed if Piastri isn't a multiple world champion, because I watched him very closely on the way up through the ranks. His F3 season was brilliant. His F2 season was brilliant. Winning them both as a rookie is really hard to do. And I want to see him fulfill that potential. I was a bit surprised he was a bit more inconsistent last year than I expected him to be. So for him, it's all about consistency in 25. And for Norris, it's about, it has to be my way. Yeah,
interesting. All right, well, we'll get back onto the drivers in a moment. But just quickly to come back to you, it sounds like through your career, you've sort of jumped in and taken on challenges that... well, perhaps outside of your comfort zone, I guess that's fair to say. With all of the books is a perfect example, but also in the broadcasting, the leaps you took. Is that fair to say that's part of your character, this idea of leaping into the unknown?
Yeah, and also I think it feeds into that fact that I grew up in an environment, again, in a racing family, and so there's a brilliant quote by Fangio, and he was talking about Schumacher when he met him, just not long before Fangio died, and he said, there are those who like to stay out of trouble, and then there are the adventurers. Yeah. He said, and proper racing drivers are adventurers. The more difficult something is, the more satisfaction we get from it. And that is the truest expression ever of, if someone says to me, what makes a racing driver, a proper racing driver, that's the answer right there. He was talking about Schumacher because he could see it in Schumacher. He's a champion. He could see it. And Schumacher wasn't a champion when he met him, but he could tell he was going to be. And so for me, growing up, it rubbed off, was like, you always have to keep challenging yourself. You only get one life. Yeah. And I'm, well over halfway through mine. and I didn't want to at any point, and I certainly don't want to look back and say, I ducked that challenge or I ducked that challenge. So, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to put the soundtrack on Formula One Grand Prix. I achieved that. I achieved it as a full-time situation when I took over from Murray Walker when he retired in 2001, and I was 34 when I took that job on
Pretty
full
young.
time. Yeah. But I'd paid my dues. I'd commentated on a lot of Formula 3 races at Knock Hill and Paris Dakar and sports cars and you name it. I'd done thousands and thousands of hours of lower level racing commentary and that sort of thing. But I always wanted to take that challenge on. So obviously, the head of sport at ITV, Brian Barwick, at the time said, "This is the greatest challenge in sports broadcasting, taking over from someone like Murray Walker." But Murray was 77. He couldn't continue because the travel was too much, but understandably, and someone had to do it, and I was his understudy anyway. He missed a race in 2000, and I stood in, and that was very useful because I could really analyze it and go through it and just see where I went wrong and where I could improve and that sort of thing. So just that was a challenge, and then all the way along, I think just wanted to take on challenges. I had 25 years of broadcasting. I wanted to start my own platform, which we did. Web platform had a completely different way of monetizing it at the time. All of those things, taking on the business challenge of that was really interesting. Working with big brands, helping brands tell their story in through content. All of these things, and then what I'm doing today, working for Motorsport Network, and we own Autosport, motorsport.com in 15 languages. Got a really interesting business model, really interesting group of people, half of them based in New York and quite a few in the UK and around the world. And it's a really, really interesting challenge to make this business work. And so I always want to keep doing that, but it definitely comes from being with racing people.
Well, I really want to get into this next challenge of what you're doing today and the business side of motorsport that you've become so heavily involved in, because there's so much I think we can learn from that. But just before we get there, what would you say to people today who are faced with this potential leap into the unknown? If they've got an opportunity, but naturally people are scared of that. There's a fear of the unknown, I think, in all humans. What were the things that if you're having a bit of self-talk before one of these moments, what do you tell yourself? What do you remind yourself before taking the leap that settles those nerves, that allows you to go head on into that risk that other people can learn from?
I think it's really important in life, if you can, try not to have fear about what you're going into. It's very easy to talk yourself out of something. To have a fear or to worry about, because it's always important to say, well, what's the worst that can happen? What have you got to lose? And I suppose as you get older and you get more entrenched in certain things and what have you, maybe you take a risk by doing something if you need to maintain your livelihood or whatever. Particularly when you're younger, it's easier because you it's like, what's the worst that can happen, sort of thing.
But some of those things, there were the risk for you, for example, stepping into Murray Walker's shoes to take over at ITV. The risk was pretty high that it might have gone wrong, and from a reputation point of view, which a career like this is heavily influenced by, that could have gone wrong. So there must have been a fear.
I think on a technical level, I backed myself that I knew how to do it. I wasn't going to sort of suddenly corpse on air. I wasn't going to run out of things to say. I knew technically how to get in and out of the brakes. I knew Martin very well. I worked with him at the Brabham team. One of my first jobs in Formula One was looking after him and Mark Blundell for a year, and so I knew Martin very, very well. And then, of course, I'd been working as the Pitlane reporter for a few years. Yeah. So, he and I were always talking. We were always collaborating and still talk a lot to this day. And so I backed myself from a technical point of view to be able to do it. The question was, would people like it? Yeah. And of course, I knew automatically that some people would hate it because it wasn't the same. Change is always a bad thing in some people's eyes. And at the end of the day, there's a reason why Murray Walker, even now, is considered to be the voice of motorsport. He hasn't picked up a microphone. He was no longer with us, sadly, but 2001 was his last, proper, if you like, TV commentary. That's a very long time ago, but he's still considered the voice of motorsport of Formula One today. So what can you do about that? It's I can only do my best.
And I wasn't the bits you can control.
Control the bits you can control. Exactly that. Just like the racers do. And I suppose it helps a little bit that I didn't mind too much what people said. And I think it also helped that this was before social media. I mean, as we went along, obviously social media kicked in, and then, of course, you get all sorts of crazy stuff. And again, you just can't let that get to you because it would pull you down if you did. So I never did. I didn't let me get it to me at all. But I did it my way. A lot of people liked it. Some people didn't like it. We won 3 BAFTAs. We won a lot of Royal Television Society awards. I'm proud of what we did, and and we always look back on the races and say, could we have done this better? That was a bit of a mess how we got into that commercial break. Always like, not for hours, but just did a bit of a debrief. Martin and I would always try and improve. And I think what we prided ourselves on as a commentary team was that we were always in the moment.
Yeah.
We anticipated things that were going to happen because we both know how to read a race, and we know how the strategies work and all that. So we anticipated. We weren't reacting to things. We were ahead of, in a way, and we were always therefore in the moment. And then obviously you get surprises, like the bloke that ran across the track at Silverstone. You don't expect that to happen. There's a lot of things you don't expect to happen, and you need to be ready for those things and be calm, and be reactive, and again find the right words. But I think what helped us was we were always ahead of the game. We were always in the moment, and therefore that was what we always tried to achieve.
So I guess it comes down to those same things: the idea of preparation and being analytical about the things that may have not gone quite so well, so you can improve in the future. All of those things feed into being ready for your next opportunity.
And being self-critical as well. That's the thing, is there's no room for complacency really in anything in life, because
it's very much a motorsport trait, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the moment you get complacent, you're going to get replaced, or you're going to fall behind. So that's something that definitely rubs off on you. It's very interesting, actually. You do this podcast and you call it Pitlane Life Lessons, because I think a lot of people that work in the profession, whatever they do, they kind of motor on and they plow through life, and they do their 20 years or their 15 years or their 35 years, whatever it may be. They don't really spend a lot of time reflecting on these things, that actually so much of what they learn from being in that environment rubs off on every aspect of their lives. I thought about it for the first time when I became a father. I've got two sons, aptly named Enzo and Emerson, 23 and 20 now. And so as a father, I sort of became very conscious of some of these qualities and things, and because you want to encourage them in your children, but of course you don't want to be a domineering dad. So getting that balance is really right. But it's great what you're doing actually with this, because I think a lot of people don't really think about about how the sport affects them and rubs off on them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you. I want to bring it into what you're doing today, and we just talked about motorsport traits. I'm really interested because what you do today is you've got the job title of President of Motorsport Business and F1 Liaison at Motorsport Network. Huge organisation, as you said. You're across all aspects of so many different things, which is really fascinating. But a lot of what you do is working on the business side on the commercial side and the business side of Formula One. It's brought you into that. You've interviewed a lot of people for the podcast. I'm really interested in some of these titans of industry that you've now come across in the commercial side. Do you see many of the same traits that you see in some of the most successful racing drivers that you've been lucky enough to spend time with over the years?
That's a really, really good question. Yes and no. Yes, you do, in the sense of people who are at the top of their game, who know they're at the top of their game, but also know that they not only do they need to keep improving, but they need to keep their organization improving, because they've got shareholders, customers, whatever it may be, you need to always keep moving forward and evolve. And in some businesses, especially tech-focused businesses, things like that, you need to innovate. But you certainly need to keep moving forward and being self-critical. And so the requirements of being a CEO or a senior executive of those big kind of companies is very similar to what you have if you want to succeed in Formula One, running a team or being a driver. So to answer your question, what I see those people coming into the environment, whether that be the paddock, the motorhomes, the hospitality units, or at business events, which I've done a lot of, business forums, business exchanges, moderating panels, that kind of thing. And I've done some fascinating ones with really, really interesting people. But it's always, the dynamic is always that the CEOs and those people are hungry to learn from the Toto Wolffs, from the Lewis Hamiltons, from the Jean Todds of this world, the Ross Brauns of this world, the drivers. And the smart drivers and the smart team principals are also very keen to learn from them. So one of the reasons why Toto Wolff, I think, has been as successful as he has is because he's not on transmit all the time.
Yeah.
He listens as much as he talks, particularly in those kind of environments. And he's tried to bring a lot of the learnings into the way he runs a Formula One team. I think one of the things that we haven't really touched on yet is longevity. And one of the challenges I think in our sport, I'd be interested to hear your view on this, is how you achieve longevity, because it's so relentless. And it's, I think I did 16 years of every single Grand Prix at one point.
Yeah.
And then that got to the point where my kids were sort of 3-4 years old, or my oldest one was. And so I throttled it back a bit. And, I go to sort of 14, 15 a year, or now 12 or something like that. But to do 24 it's really hard to get longevity. Yeah. And what I see now, and I look at a lot of these people, is fatigue.
Yeah, I think it's a real risk that this sport faces. I think in life, in terms of longevity, whether it's Formula One or business in general, the early part of your life when you're young and you've got energy, I'm a big believer that if you're trying to build a business or you're trying to build a career, go all out, go flat out when you've got the time and the energy at that point, without the sort of family commitments that we all have today. Go for it. And I'm not a big believer in this idea of work-life balance being this, it should be the same all the way through life. I think different phases of your life, you should be able to go flat out. If you enjoy it, if you see some goal at the end of it, go for it. But at some point, you have to realise that if that's starting to affect you in a negative sense from a physical or a mental situation, you have to listen to that. And I think that's the problem, that motorsport and Formula One is such a competitive industry that's the driving force. So if there's a competitive advantage to just keeping going, even though you're seeing some negative impacts on the people, it's the competitive element that wins typically in Formula One. And I almost feel like the sport needs to step in and save itself from itself, because the teams are unlikely to do that. Some teams are doing it now. They're starting to rotate crews and people over the season. But as long as they see a competitive advantage in keeping the consistency, for example, in a pit crew, you don't want to be changing your pit crew, they'll keep it, and they'll keep everybody at 24 races until the sport steps in and maybe says, your pass is now only going to work for 20 races a year. And so you have to build that into your strategy, where you have to start rotating people. So I completely agree with you. I think the sport is growing to such an extent. The calendar's getting longer. The places we're visiting are further away and further afield. We have to accept that is a challenge now that the sport, I think, needs to take seriously. And it may be that the regulators need to step in over and above the teams, because competitive nature will win over perhaps the sort of the human side of the sport sometimes.
I mean, when you were working for McLaren, you would do the races. There would be sort of 17, 18 a year in those days. So you got 50% more races now than there were when I was ITV. You were at McLaren, and I don't know what else you had to do. You had to go back, strip the cars back to the factory. As I understand it now, if you're a Formula One race mechanic, you're only doing the races, and then between races, you're obviously, if they're triple headers and things like that, you're away for that whole period of time. But between races, when you have this sort of couple of weeks gap and stuff, you're at home and you're not doing anything.
That's right. So there are measures now coming into place. There's a curfew that means you can't stay at the track all night. There's a summer shutdown, which we didn't used to have. We used to go testing as well as racing. So there was all of those things. So I guess it balances out in some way. It's just that it's the sheer length of time that the season now goes on for, because we're now stretching into December, starting in February, if you count testing. There's no separate test teams anymore. So it's a long period of time. I never want to sit here and ever sort of try and get the violins out for people working in Formula One.
No, because no one makes you do it.
No, exactly right. And I think that's the point. You can always leave if you want to, and people do.
Yeah, they definitely do.
It's not for everybody. But I think it comes back to having that competitive nature, the kind of people that operate well in this sport, and I'm sure it's exactly the same in the real competitive sides of business. You've got to have that competitive drive. It's got to be more than just a job you're doing for the paycheck. You're fully invested in trying to win, and that's the point. And I think that's what makes successful companies as well as successful Formula One teams.
Yeah, and certainly there's that real business dynamic. I mean, there's over 300 sponsors now in Formula One for the first time in its history, and more coming in all the time. February the 18th, that livery launch event at the O2, you're going to see a whole bunch of new companies that have not been in Formula One before, or maybe a few that have been in the past, but then they've thought, this sport's really cool, we're coming in, You got brands like Glenfiddich, getting involved in Formula One, Scotch whiskey, and all kinds of, different brands who, look at the scale that MasterCard have come in with McLaren. I went to a MasterCard event in Vegas, and it was fantastic. They'd hired the Cirque du Soleil thing. There was only about 20 of us there, but
it's like the good old days.
Oh my God, it was brilliant. But their message, delivered by their representative and Zach Brown, crystal clear, understood what the alignment was. You can see what both sides are getting out of this, and obviously Zach's an absolute ninja when it comes to the whole sponsorship piece and giving the sponsors value for money and all the rest of it. But you can see how there's a great compatibility between companies and a sport like Formula One. That it's a wonderful, first of all, high-speed showcase.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's innovated and changed its audience profile. So it's now got far more female fans, far more younger fans. And it's not just Drive to Survive. Don't let anyone tell you. And there's a lot of people that was the gateway drug, Drive to Survive, for a lot of people, yes, but you then had to have a sport that was ready to receive them with its social media offerings from the drivers, with the Formula One themselves doing a great job. We like to think we're doing a pretty good job of giving customers and readers and everything else what they want on our platforms. And, the sport was ready to receive these new audiences. And now we've got to keep them and continue to cultivate new audiences in new territories as well. And that's the sort of relentlessness of the sport. So to your point, as it becomes more relentless and therefore voracious, it's important to maintain your energy, and it's important to keep your eyes on what you're trying to do and how you can keep on improving and not fail to improve simply just because you're so fatigued.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice way for us to draw this to a close, is to leave people with some lessons that we've learned from this, because you're absolutely right. Formula One is an absolute master at innovation, both from a sort of technical point of view on the cars, which is always the obvious thing we see, the upgrades coming and how more quickly the cars are by the end of the season from where they were at the beginning. But I think actually much more than that, the organisations of a Formula One team, Formula One itself under Liberty Media, a massive amount of innovation continuously. And I always think back, if we're going to look at people's individual lives, whether you're running a business or just a guy at home, looking to build a personal brand or looking to become successful, I think there's so many traits that we've just touched on in that couple of sentences there that people can take into their own lives and apply, whether you get them from Formula One or elsewhere. I think they're so valuable. Those little ideas I've just touched on, surely they can be beneficial to everybody, right?
100%, yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to it is authenticity and integrity. For me, if you had to distill it all down, and sort of relentless self-improvement, that's relentless self-improvement is what's embodied by people like Schumacher, that like we talked about earlier on, and it is he's the gold standard for how you should operate in Formula One and always be challenging yourself to do better. I think you always need to do it with integrity. We both know quite a lot of people, or many people, who we've encountered in our years in Formula One who have very little or no integrity, and that's the way they choose to operate. That's the way they choose to act. Maybe there'll be some kind of reckoning for them at some point in their lives, but for sure they can't look in the mirror and say, I have always acted with integrity in my life. And for me, that is the most important thing. Yeah. Nobody will be able to tell you that I have ever acted without integrity, and that's for me the most important thing. And then the final thing is authenticity, which also includes distinctiveness. I think it's really important, whatever you do in life, to understand the environment you're in, the context you're doing what you're doing in, and to make what you have to say and what you have to offer distinctive in some way, because that's really, really important. There's a lot of signals and noise around, and to just produce more signals and more noise is not interesting, especially if you're in a role or in a business that's customer facing. You've got to find some point of differentiation, something that makes you distinctive and stand out, and always do it within authenticity. If you go too far off beam into areas that you're not really, not so much qualified on, but just things which don't feel authentic and genuine, people are super sophisticated and they'll sniff it out, and they can smell a phony a mile away, right? So I think it's really important to always keep those three things in mind. And I guess if you want to distill down everything I've learned, in 35 years now in Formula One, I think it's those three things. Yeah.
Well, what a wonderful way to draw this to a close. I think that's a Pitlane life lesson right there, if I ever heard one. I think, James, it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. I think we've learned a lot. You've got so much tucked away in that brain of yours from all of these experiences over time that you've had. But look, I think you've set out to achieve something from when you were just a teenager. You've undoubtedly done that. You've put the storyline, the soundtrack onto some of these iconic moments. The one we started with in 2008, as I said, gave me shivers and goosebumps. I'm sure it did for many, many other people when they get to watch that back. So that's something to be hugely proud of. You've commentated and narrated so many big moments in sport. I think that's something you've done with integrity. You've done it in the way that is authentic. And ultimately, you've been a very nice guy all the way through that. And that's what's helped you build relationships with. Today, you've gone on to build businesses and to help people run their businesses. You're now heavily involved in the running of the sport and how the future of this sport looks with Liberty Media. That's an amazing legacy combined with everything you've already done that I think in the future will go on to, you'll look back on with huge pride. So I think I'm very grateful that you came along here. I think everybody listening will be as well. So thank you so much. And I hope we can do it again one time.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you for having me. And I think you and I have got something quite a bit in common in the sense that we always want to challenge ourselves. I'm full of admiration for the way you've reinvented yourself in what you're doing as a broadcaster and a storyteller with a different perspective. And again, that whole point of differentiation, right? You know, what makes you distinctive is you were on the shop floor, you know, building those cars, delivering and understanding what racing drivers need. So to reinvent yourself in a way that enriches the audience's understanding is great. And one final thing I would love to say to your audiences, you mentioned about the shaping the future of the sport. We've got another global F1 fan survey coming up, which we're doing together in partnership with Formula One. That's going to launch after the O2 livery launch event. And fans can make their voices heard and talk about all different things from who their favourite drivers are to all kinds of things about the rules and changes to the sport for the future. So everybody look out for that because we want to hear as many voices as we can from as many parts of the world and as many different parts of the demographic spectrum as we possibly can. So thanks for having me today and let's look forward to a strong future for Formula One.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for mentioning that. That's so good because I think that's such a valuable thing that Formula One does today, along with yourself, because it's collecting that sort of data and feedback. We talked about it early on, being analytical about yourself as a sport. This is a great way to do that by canvassing the people that watch it. We're nothing without our fans. So it's a great thing that you're doing there. And yeah, if you're, if you're into Formula One, which I know you all are, keep an eye out for that and please do get involved. So thank you so much, James.
Cheers. Good to see you.
Well, what a lovely conversation that was with one of Formula One's nicest guys, I think, but also one of the most successful. It was really interesting sharing some of his learnings from working so closely with superstars like Michael Schumacher and Nigel Mansell, but comparing that to those in the modern era of Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton. Some really interesting comparisons. But then again, comparing that to titans of the business world and of course what we can all learn from that. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did having it, and until we meet again, don't forget this: do the right things, do the things right.